Well, hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about ecosystem design and strategic investment in landscapes. Now, when we first set that as our topic, I thought, oh, easy, do, a few hours of conversation about this with some really great information. Well, it turns out we could pretty much do, hundreds of hours on this topic. So I hope that I've been able to sift through all of the materials and come up with something that's at least compelling, although it may not be comprehensive. And in that regard, I hope that you will ask questions and we can bring them up at the end in conversation and perhaps even think about how we might use all of this in the future for other classes. So the topics are going to be divided into these 6 sections. We're going to start by talking about something called syntropy, which is maybe a new concept to some of you. It is the underlying concept for all life on the planet. So we'll start there when we talk about ecosystems. Then we will talk, oh, well, for some reason, this actually isn't in the right order, which yeah, so forget it. I'm just going to dive into it. There we go. So what is syntropy is still the first thing. And then we're going to talk about the simplicity of complexity. Sometimes we get wrapped up in the idea that things are so complex, how do we begin? And so we're going to go through a couple of case studies, and we're going to talk about simple things that we can do to kick off complexity. Then we will address specifically landscape installation investments. Is there a hierarchy to investing in landscapes? Where do we actually get the most value out of the least amount of input? And how do we think about it in the context of syntropic projects? Then we'll shift a little bit to value-added design and how do we really improve our ability to create nature-based solutions and add value in the design process. Then we will get into how to value landscapes and start to talk about a bunch of different models that are being used, but also some tools that we ourselves can use to come up with values and then convey those values to clients and to other people in the ecosystem. And finally, we'll talk about the multiplier effect that community benefits bring to the whole thing. A lot of landscape design, a lot of projects that have to do with design and development kind of take the community benefits out of the equation and don't think about how are humans in this and how are they changing within the system. So we're going to address that. And that is the somewhat lofty agenda for today. Let's go. What's syntropy? Well, essentially, syntropy and entropy represent a dynamic interaction. And the two forces they're universal. So this is really how the universe is organized. It's organized by entropy and syntropy. And this dynamicism, this balance, this movement between these two conditions is actually what gives rise to all life on the planet. Most of what we talk about in design, especially in the built environment, ends up focusing on entropy. And I'll define all this in a second, but you see at the bottom of the balance that visible and invisible are on that scale. And this is really why we want to talk about syntropy today, and we want to bring that word into our language about nature-based solutions, because a lot of what goes on in syntropic design is actually invisible to the eye, and so it needs to be illuminated by humans who can talk about it and who can share it with other people. So let's start with entropy. What the heck is that? That sounds like a really big word. And why are we talking about, physics and so forth in a landscape class? But bear with me here. Entropy is essentially the universal tendency toward disorder, decay, and randomness. So essentially, it's the idea that as soon as you have built something, it is immediately moving toward kind of inevitable decrease in disorder, and it has to do with like degradation of materials and decline of systems. It can also be used to describe a loss of connection or a loss of communication within a system or loss of information within a system. And basically, when someone asks me what entropy is, I usually say, yeah, it's the tendency of things to fall apart and decay. It is essentially the second law of thermodynamics. So, you can repeat that at a cocktail party and people think you sound smart, but basically, tendency of things to fall apart and decay. Examples of entropy in our built environment and in landscapes in particular are things like the heat island effect contributing to more violent weather patterns. There is a correlation and causation between the rising temperature of the land and also of the resulting temperature rise of the ocean that is creating these effects of unraveling, really, of ecosystems, desertification, extended drought periods, weather patterns that are incredibly violent and unpredictable. These overdrafting of groundwater as a result of drought and soil degradation. These are all things that are symbols or are indicators that we are in an entropic situation. An excellent example, horrible example of entropic situations is this global temperature rise leading to ice caps melting and leading then to sunny day high tide flooding in Miami. These things are related, and they are essentially the degradation of an ecosystem or of a system, actually very big systems, in this case, weather, tides, etc. And when we see the increase in flooding due to sea level rise, we also are experiencing a degradation of the coastal sawgrass marsh community in and around the Everglades in Florida. And that's because we now have Gulf saltwater intrusion, and that is affecting the sawgrass. And drought is affecting the sawgrass. And when the sawgrass is degraded, we actually get a degradation of a city's ability to weather or be resilient in weather or weather weather extremes like hurricanes, which of course places like Florida are prone to. And so this is an excellent example. We've talked in these 4 slides about sort of 4 different components of an entropic situation. When we see things like haboobs and dust storms, we know that they're a consequence of no soil structure in the Midwest. A haboob is a dust storm that accompanies the monsoonal season. And so places like Arizona, for example, see haboobs along with their monsoon, the fall and late summer monsoons. But dust storms in places like as far flung as Iowa and Kansas and so forth, these are happening right now. We're used to thinking about this as something that happened back in the 1930s, but this is going on multiple times a year, and they are absolutely directly related to the fact that agricultural practices in the Midwest have destroyed the soil structure, just as it was back in the Dust Bowl. It's everything's old is new again. And so we see that this is an example of an entropic situation. Destroy soil structure, we get a degradation of a system, and we get effects like this. When we don't have soil structure in the Midwest, not only do we get dust storms, but we also get hypoxic dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. And so why is that happening? Well, because the soil has been destroyed, soil structure has been destroyed, which means that all the fertilizer and herbicides and pesticides and everything else that's being used in those agricultural systems throughout the Midwest are actually accumulating here in the Gulf of Mexico. And so they're destroying ecosystems within this aquatic environment as well. So yeah, I think you're getting the idea of what entropy is all about, but I got a couple more examples. Clear cutting in British Columbia. This is a direct result of law, this is a practice for logging, and it is it's soil and plant disturbance. And the result of this clear cutting has actually released more greenhouse gas into the atmosphere than fossil fuel emissions in the same area. And so it's important for us to understand that this soil disturbance of growing ecosystems has a massive impact on things that we don't usually think about, like greenhouse gas emissions. Normally, we attribute all that to, tailpipe emissions and so forth that are coming out of cars and needing to use more green energy and needing to do more things to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, soil disturbance is a massive contributor. And we also now can track soil moisture. This is something we've been able to do thanks to NASA launching, 10 years ago, launching some satellites that were measuring soil moisture at various depths. They now have a new mission, which is essentially all about earth science. And so the data is getting super granular and really really helpful for trying to look at the effects of various climate related activities. And so NASA's Earth Science mission is actually tracking soil moisture and plant health. And what they have found is that there are these occasional soil moisture deficits, and they have been able, so all the brown stuff is moisture deficit, by the way, they have been able to correlate that with fire events and actually show that many fire events are happening simultaneously with soil moisture deficits. So again, these are examples of this entropic effect that happens in landscapes, in the environment. So what is the balancing force here? The balancing force is syntropy. And syntropy is a force of organization and accumulation of energy. It's a tendency to become more complex, more orderly over time. And this particular effect or phenomenon is actually the way we describe super complex and super multi-layered events like the formation of life on the planet. That was a syntropic event, an evolution of a complex system or from a simple system to becoming more complex. This is an example of syntropy. And in landscape, we talk about the building of fertility, biodiversity, abundance, and connection that leads to an increased resilience in a community or in a soil, a soil or in a agricultural system. That is an example of syntropy. When we have an optimization of sunlight and space in plant ecosystems. When we find that biodiverse groups are actually working together the way that plants and the soil microbiome work together in collaboration, that it's not a competitive environment. That's absolutely that's kind of applying some kind of entropic viewpoint on it. It's actually not degrading. It's a collaborative approach that's going on in soil that these groups are supporting and nourishing each other. And when we see that self-sustaining systems are actually mimicking nature or human developed self-sustaining systems, these are syntropic systems. And so examples of that, on the big scale are like when galaxies are created from the debris of dying galaxies. That is a perfect example of more complexity, but I'll bring it down to earth. When we see bacteria colonizing fungal cells. So we know bacteria colonizes everything. But when we see bacteria colonizing fungal cells and creating a symbiotic relationship between these two microbes, and that symbiotic relationship actually manifests a life form, that's syntropy. Nature naturally organizes itself into more complex ecosystems, even at the smallest level. Many of you might have seen this picture before. It looks like a cave, with some kind of shrubs and so forth, but actually it's about a 3-inch crack in the sidewalk. And it shows that at every level, nature is trying to organize itself, trying to become more complex. And in an ecosystems context, when we are doing ecosystems thinking, when we're doing syntropic design or syntropic processes, when we're evaluating them, we're looking for the ways that various ecosystem services are interconnected. How do things relate to each other? How can they become more complex? So for example, if I'm trying to design something or build something that I want to be self-sustaining and resilient, I want to think about, how do I maximize solar energy collection? It's free. Plants know how to do it better than anything else on the planet. So how do I get that energy source into my system for the system to use? How do I maximize the cycling of minerals and nutrients in my system? How do I maximize the cycling of water on my system so that I'm not just looking at it as, plants use water, but I'm thinking about, how do plants contribute to weather control? How does evapotranspiration cool the environment? I want to look at also how to maximize conditions for biodiversity. Because as it turns out, biodiversity is one of the pieces of this interconnected puzzle that is like a keystone concept. If we don't have biodiversity, we can't accomplish anything else in our process. And I also, some of you may have seen this picture before, and it's really just showing how systems could go from being a crack on a wall or a crack on the ground to being something really complex with a lot of different components to it. These plants are absolutely maximizing solar, water, mineral, and biodiversity cycles, and they are exploiting opportunities. They're collaborating to exploit those opportunities. It's a resilient design. It's syntropic in its essence. Native prairies are another example of syntropic landscapes. Here's an example of a syntropic landscape that you may have read about. This is living infrastructure. I don't know how to pronounce this in Chinese, so I'm going to, it's not always obvious, but I'm going to read it as it appears in English. And please, my apologies to those of you that speak Chinese or understand Chinese, but Shenzhen is the city, and they have pursued a living infrastructure in all things policy, essentially converting as much of their gray infrastructure into green infrastructure and weaving that living infrastructure into pretty much every element of their urban development. It is mitigating sea level rise, it mitigates weather impacts and flooding. It's a tremendous project. I recommend you take a look at it. Perfect example of designing for complexity, syntropic design. Now switching from Chinese to I'm not sure. It might be Dutch, or maybe even German. Ernst Gutsch, and this is he explored syntropic agricultural processes. And what he essentially explored was how to reclaim completely degraded landscapes that were former climax forests that had been denuded and turned into agriculture in Brazil, where soils are very shallow and really it's the climax forest that has the most ecosystem value. Agriculture is usually very short-lived and has a very degrading effect on the land. And Ernst showed that you could take a monoculture and a system that used a lot of chemicals because humans weren't able to manage it without those chemicals, and you could restore it to a primary forest. And all those papers are going to be included in the materials that we send to you. But I want to show you this picture because if any of you are familiar with the permaculture idea of food forest, you'll understand that this is essentially food forest on um, steroids, but actually not on steroids. This is a demonstration that the system, when it is nudged, when there is human impact that pushes it into its natural inclination, it will actually move into a system that generates abundance and that promotes cooperation, not just of the plants and the microbes and the insects and the plants and so forth, but also of the people who are involved in designing, installing, managing, and thinking about this landscape. So this restoration and regeneration is really an epic example of syntropic design in agricultural settings. Here's another wonderful example of syntropic design. This is the Bosco Verticale, and it's in Milan, and it's essentially called a house for trees inhabited by humans, where urban living has been directly juxtaposed and actually embedded into nature, and nature has been directly embedded into urban living. It's a really incredible example of a highly complex and becoming more complex as it matures and as people interact with it. It's an incredible design. But we can get a lot more simple example of syntropy if we just think about how do plants actually inhabit native landscapes. And this concept of succession, which is a fundamental concept for understanding ecosystems, is really a beautiful and really, it's almost like this is the only one you should talk about. It's a beautiful example of syntropic design. Essentially, land areas will mature and evolve. The plant material and the microbiome work together in any land area, and they are working together to essentially advance the community from being a primarily bacterially dominated landscape, which has there's fungal there's a fungal component in that, very basic landscape that is essentially, let's say, like bare rock or rock that's just covered with some lichen. There is fungi in that, but it is dominated by bacterial microbiome. And so the plants that are able to thrive there are, only particular types of plants. But over time, as the plants, uh, farm and manage the microbiome, and as the microbiome edits the genes of the plants, this entire system will actually move with enough time and yeah, with enough time and also without events that degrade it, it will move through time and it will become more and more and more complex until it is essentially a fungally dominated um, climax community, a climax plant community. And in places where it never achieves a more fungal dominance, uh, it's it's interesting to kind of look at it and see what are the things or the events that are actually either inhibiting the succession or are reversing succession. So, but succession is an example of syntropic design. And so too is, and this succession is absolutely dependent on the underground networks of fungi and microbial life. I put this up there because I want you all to be aware of the Society for the Protection of the Underground Networks, SPUN. This is an incredible organization that has been doing just absolutely amazing research on these super complex networks of fungi and microbial life all across the planet. I want you to all be aware of them and support them, and really see how this the research that they're doing is directly applicable to landscapes. Yeah, read up on them. Okay, finally, the sort of last place that we're going to land in talking about syntropy is when we talk about the balanced watershed. This is a slide that we've shown for probably 15 years in every single one of our classes, and we always talk about how the balanced watershed is the model for our landscape design, installation, and management. And but I think putting this concept of syntropy on top of, just presenting what you see on the screen, you can begin to really understand how delicate this balance is, and it's organized into these watersheds. Water is cycling in these places. It is moving through plants. It's moving through soil, and the water that is uh, able to move through plants and soil nurtures and nourishes stream flow and river flow. It nourishes groundwater. It nourishes the plants themselves and allows them to have a soil water reservoir that they can draw on even during times of extreme drought. And they can also have enough oxygen in the soil so that when there are times of flooding and so forth, they are not impacted by that. The water is cycled directly through the plants. The plants manage the water really on it over terrestrial areas by putting it back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. In many of and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but in many of our valuations of landscape, we sort of take evapotranspiration and put it into like a negative bucket, as though, well, that's what plants need. That's what plants use. That's the water demand of the landscape. And yet it's kind of unfair because that evapotranspiration process is a cooling process. It's cooling our planet. It's cooling our cities. It's creating the clouds that could actually reprecipitate that rain on the terrestrial areas. It's managing the water that is available to recharge our streams and provide, water abundance really for every creature that's on the planet. So this concept of a balanced watershed is really important in thinking about syntropic design, because a healthy, balanced watershed is kind of, the epitome of a syntropic design. The other thing also that is cycling here is carbon, of course. And we kind of get really, hung up on valuing carbon and looking at carbon in landscapes and in our environment. And it's important to realize that right here, this picture is not just showing water, it's also showing carbon cycling into the soil, being actually sequestered in the soil, but also being removed from soil, put back into the atmosphere for the benefit of plants. It's showing plants removing large quantities of carbon to put it into the microbial community while they photosynthesize. So there's a lot going on in this picture, and it's all syntropic. It becomes more complex, more balanced, more organized. And pretty much all life on the planet is interconnected by a watershed. Even in places that are deserts, they are part of watersheds. And so I love this picture because to me, it shows the watershed in almost like veins. And I think it's important for us to start to really understand that until we acknowledge this interconnectedness of the land mass, but also of all the creatures that are dependent on a watershed, and including humans, we are never really going to be able to create nature-based solutions that are, self-sustaining and that are truly resilient. So this concept of the watershed is absolutely fundamental, and it is, as I said, the epitome of a syntropic design. Now, human intervention does play a role in whether or not ecosystems are moving, through entropy or through syntropy. And one of the things that, as landscape practitioners and professionals, we want to acknowledge that we have a role in this, that it's imperative that we are part of it, and not just us as individuals, but us as humanity. And as it applies specifically to landscapes, it means that we need to spend a lot more time observing what's happening in landscapes, observing what the effects of things are, doing measurement of outcomes, predicting outcomes, and then determining whether or not we are matching our predictions, working in teams to have effect on landscapes. And then when we do intervene into the landscape or into the natural environment, we do it in a really targeted manner. And the purpose of that intervention is really to set things back into balance and to set natural processes going so that they can become more complex. Syntropy. So after all of that, let's talk about some simple ways that we can kick off complexity and talk about a few case studies that actually address that. So one of the most simple interventions that we can do, especially as designers, but also as contractors who are installing plants or being asked to do design as part of design build, is to plant densely. Dense planting kicks off a huge number of ecosystem benefits. And we've talked about this experiment before, but I want to come back to it because I just made that statement that planting densely is very important. So too is planting diversely. These two things go together. We want to plant a lot of plants in a space, And we want to make sure that it's not just one plant, but that it is a diversity of plant leaf structures, root structures, species, families. And the importance of this diversity actually came out of a very long-term study that is being conducted in Jena, Leipzig, Germany. It's called the Genobiodiversity Field Experiment. And essentially what they've done is, in a lot of the plots that we see in research on plant material, we see monocultures being grown or very low polyculture, 2, 3, 4 things being planted together maybe. But for the most part, it's monoculture. And we try to um, project or ascertain from what we observe on those monocultures how that plant is going to perform in a landscape. So we look at these monocultures and we try to determine their irrigation requirements and their nutrient requirements and their pruning and mowing and all kinds of stewardship, and even things like the husbandry of them for reproducing them. It's done in monoculture. And the Jena experiment said, yeah, monoculture is not a model of syntropy. Monoculture is a model of entropy. And so they started planting plants of multiple species, multiple families, and seeing how do these things work together? Are there benefits that are derived from this plant richness? And what they found over the last 15 years, and this is ongoing, and it's actually super interesting to read about. I recommend you go online. I know we've sent out the link previously, but what they found is as plant richness increases, in other words, diversity of plant material increases, key ecosystem health and disease improve right along with it. We see greater pathogen resistance with a more diverse landscape. We see weed suppression, unwanted plants. That just makes sense when you have lots of diversity. We see a increase in decomposition and efficiency of decomposition. We see pollination increases and more diversity is actually sparked, if you will, by the diversity of the plant material. And essentially, the outcome of the Jena experiment is more is more. And this is really important for us to begin to think about in landscaping because, we're going to get into value added design. A lot of the time we're doing value engineered design, value engineered installations where we're trying to cut to meet a budget. And in doing so, we sometimes miss the importance of having these very densely planted, very diverse landscapes. And there are simple ways to measure your biodiversity indices in the field. So we use this on our polyculture lawn project. iNaturalist is terrific. You can set that up to actually allow you to evaluate all of your projects and look at them and determine biodiversity, especially of plant material, but also of other creatures. We use the Merlin Bird ID app in order to ID birds that are in the system and register. You can take a picture or you can actually record the sound of them singing and it will identify the birds. It's actually an incredibly amazing app. I've used it and 3 or 4 birds are singing and it will come up with all those birds. It's really cool. And then also we use the bug identifier, but there are other insect identifiers. All of these are things that if we put these into our practices, whether we're designing or building, or we're managing a landscape, or we're even regulating landscapes, having this ability to kind of instantaneously connect with a much bigger group of people, the hive mind of humans, to record and learn about the biodiversity that's happening in our landscapes is a really important aspect um, of this. So I want to talk about a couple of case studies. And this one is really fascinating because it's absolutely applicable pretty much anywhere in the country, including California. There are actually several of these projects underway in California. And this is the Akira Miyawaki pocket forest method. Uh, Dr. Miyawaki came up with this idea, which was essentially if we want to have very rapid growth of forests and have them become self-sufficient in 2 or 3 years, reducing the amount of inputs that are required to manage them to essentially nothing, we are going to need to do a couple of important things. First of all, we're going to need to plant a lot of plants very, very densely and force them to have to manage solar interaction, maximize optimize their solar energy, maximize and optimize their nutrient cycling, and optimize their water requirement and also their water dispersal into the atmosphere. So these pocket forests are used really in areas that are highly degraded and also in areas that have a heat island effect that needs to be mitigated or a stormwater effect that needs to be mitigated. And we're looking here at 27 plants per 100 square feet. So it's 3 plants per every 11 square feet in these systems. And they're planted with mostly native. They really try to drill down into native species of trees and shrubs and understory at these very high densities. It's a layered system. So it's instantly complex. It's not just planting, certainly it's not just planting one tree, but it's planting multiple species of trees very close together, combined with multiple species of shrubs, combined with multiple species of ground cover. And there is an addition of organic matter into the soils in order to boost that microbiome to get the system off the ground. And as I said, they intend to become self-sufficient in 2 to 3 years. And from all the literature that I've read, they are mostly achieving that, even in dry climates like ours. So this is maybe a little bit better depiction of what's going on in the Miyawaki forest. It's much, much denser than a typical forest would be. But as a result of that, and as a result of this multi-layered design, it actually is growing 10 times faster. So that's why it's being used for urban cooling and stormwater mitigation and so forth, because its benefits are realized a lot faster, certainly than not doing anything at all. But even when you compare it to other green infrastructure projects, and even when you compare it to infrastructure projects that are gray green. So it's really a pretty interesting thing. And the other thing that they've observed, just like what the Jenna experiment observed, is that the risk of disease is lessened. They actually have a community immunity when they're planted like this. So they are sharing resources in the Miyawaki forest. When we think about installing rain gardens, it's often characterized as a targeted intervention that is only gathering rainwater from a roof and mitigating, let's say, rainwater from a roof or rainwater from some other hard surface. But when you step back, as the Pacific Institute did in this graphic, and you think about and map out the syntropic effects of having a rain garden in the landscape, you realize that one intervention is yielding all of these multiple benefits. So if you can create a rain garden solution that is easy to install and that doesn't require lots and lots of disturbance or anything that would be entropic, uh, you could actually be creating an intervention that has multiple immediate community benefits. And you can see, just by doing a rain garden, you're already on your way to building healthy soil and reducing, offsetting irrigation. You're providing habitat. And as a result of offsetting irrigation, you're reducing energy use. You don't need to use chemicals into the landscape in the rain garden, because any nutrient or any pollutant that might be running into the rain garden is actually converted into nutrient by the ecosystem, by the plant microbial ecosystem. It's more beautiful than a flat piece of land. You reduce green waste, and then each of those things that results from implementing a rain garden, a simple rain garden, they actually bloom out into even greater benefits. And so we see, if we're building soil health, we're sequestering carbon. And I actually would have drawn lines into having, healthier plant material, and so forth. So this is a perfect example of syntropy, and it's also a perfect example of the simple intervention that kickstarts the complexity of an ecosystem. And the guidance that we give on all of our projects, in all of our classes, everything that we do is very, very simple. We can capture an inch of rain or more from 1,000 square foot of hard surface. In this case, we're talking about a roof, let's say. We can capture all of that in a 150 square foot depression that's only 6 inches deep. We don't need to be digging down 3 feet. We don't need underlayment. We don't need rock. We don't need soil that has been amended with sand or compost or any of that stuff. We just need to have a depression to temporarily detain the rain. It needs to be planted, but we need to have that depression to temporarily detain the rain, a sufficient quantity of it, so it can go into the ground and it can start to yield these multiple benefits. Perfect example. When we have a rain garden that is densely planted and just a shallow depression, we actually start a process that is building stable soil aggregates. That's what healthy living soil is. This is a beautiful picture of healthy living soil. Now, what's the thing about healthy living soil? Why do we keep coming back to it? Why do we even care about this stable aggregate stuff? Well, it's because when we have soil that is like that, it actually is acting like a sponge, which means that it's holding on to water in dry times and making it available to our plants, available to our ecosystem in those dry times. And it's actually giving enough oxygen in the system so that when it does fill up and in a flood condition or super saturated condition, it actually always has a little bit of oxygen in it, so it doesn't turn aerobic and pathogenic. We also don't, and when something turns aerobic or pathogenic, that soil structure tends to decrease. And when soil structure decreases, we get things like erosion. We get movement of that soil. So, because it's not being held together anymore in these stable aggregates. So the whole idea that planting a shallow depression 6 inches deep in our landscape could actually create a soil that is not compacted anymore, or isn't just a sandy sieve, but is actually acting like a sponge. Infiltration increases, but correspondingly, water holding capacity also increases. So this is really a beautiful thing. I love this picture because it really shows you how the sponge is. So when we create these rain gardens that were originally designed just for that 1 inch rain event on a 1,000 square foot roof, we're kicking off all these multiple benefits, but we're also kicking off a syntropic process. And what happens in syntropy? Well, things become more complex. And so as the system becomes more complex, it becomes more efficient, which means that 6 months from now, a year from now, this system is able to take more water, infiltrate it faster, and hold on to more water than it was when we first built it. This is in direct contrast with building rain gardens that have all kinds of interventions in them, underlayment and rock and all that stuff. Those actually become less efficient over time as they silt up and so forth. So this is really showing us that we can make simple interventions and come up with something, that is increasingly complex on its way to self-sufficiency. Here's another case study, and this organization called Just Dig It is really incredible. They are working. They're a Dutch company, Dutch group that is working in Africa, and they have developed this technique called Earth Smiles. And what's beautiful about these Earth Smiles is that they are slowing down rain in these really super degraded landscapes and allowing that rain to infiltrate into the soil. And the cool thing is these are done by hand, and it's not just able-bodied men that are out there. These are being created by children, by women. The entire village or community can actually be involved in the creation of these Earth Smiles, and look how simple they are. I mean, this is, when people say that simple rain gardens aren't going to work, I just direct them to something like this. I'm like, well, then how does this work? These are essentially 135 square foot rain gardens. Each one of them is and by the way, when rains do happen here, it is such a flashy environment, flashy watershed, that the water comes through in massive quantities very, very quickly. So that's why there's so many of these here, these little divots in the landscape. But each of these is 135 square feet, which is pretty darn close to 150 square feet, if you ask me. And it holds up to 550 gallons per rain event, each one of them. And as I said, it's essentially preventing soil erosion. It's building the soil health over time as this water is stopped and sunk into the landscape. It cools the site. It actually drops the temperature of the site when we are putting water into the soil. And because there's water in the soil, that water becomes available to seeds and to plant material. And so plant material actually starts to grow. And the syntropic effect is that it cools down just by having water in it, but it multiplies when the plants start to grow. Here is a great example of the before and after of the Earth Smiles. They're also called buns. They are they're implemented on slope. So this isn't something that is really done on perfectly flat ground, but there's no reason really it couldn't be. It may be, it depends on your watershed, of course, but in this particular case, they're implemented on some degree of slope. And as you can see, look at this plant material. This plant material is just helping this whole system get better with time. Pretty stark contrast. So another very simple intervention that is being used also in Africa is called the stone line. The stone line does, essentially the same thing, but it's using found materials from the site, and they're just lining up stones like this to stop erosion and increase infiltration around the stones. I mean, what could be more simple than doing this? We have always recommended doing something like this. We didn't call them stone lines, but doing small piles of stones around trees on flat ground, not of course against the trunk, but at an appropriate distance at the drip line to actually slow down water and create kind of above ground cistern or capture areas. So it's a way of creating capture without having to dig. Very simple. And look, already you're seeing the complexity. They also are creating trenches on contour. So this is a little bit more like what's happening in permaculture, where trenches on contour are used to capture rainwater, larger areas, and also, again, areas that might have some slope to them. This is a very simple way of kind of combining the buns and the stone lines to create rainwater capture implementation. So in these areas where the earth smiles and the stone lines and the trenches are being implemented, plants are growing, and that grass is vital to the community for grazing, of course, cooling the environment and all the benefits that they're getting from having that plant material. And women are trained to harvest the seed of these plants, save it, and actually trade with it, use it again the following year, sell it at a local market. And in doing that, there's plenty of grass available for the communities, grazing and agriculture. And now they're sharing with other communities, building the resilience of other communities. And women are at the heart of these enterprises. They become a lot more independent with higher status, and families actually benefit from this added income. This is an important component of the entire idea of syntropy or ecosystem design. And that is that humans are integral, of course, to, nudge things one way or another, but also to create a sustainable community that sustains those humans. And we're going to find as we move along, it's not just sustain in terms of an enterprise, economic sustenance, but it's also keeping the community together, providing status and acceptance and access for people who might be marginalized otherwise in a degraded environment, and also going a level above this to creating joy, happiness, a feeling of euphoria of being in a natural environment. So there are all these levels that ecosystem design really touches on. Now, the final case study in this series is Nicholas Netien in Cyprus. So Nicholas was hired to take on creating an olive grove in Cyprus on a site that was highly degraded. It had severe drought, it had fire, it had all kinds of stuff that had degraded this landscape. Historically, thousands of years ago, there had been olive groves here, but none of that was visible anymore. And so when Nicholas approached this site, he decided that his first intervention was going to be the simple task of stacking up some rocks. And these cairns that were created play a critical role in the rejuvenation of this ecosystem. The rocks provide places for birds to perch. And when the birds perch, they release seeds that they've brought from other places. They also provide habitat for lizards, for snakes, for all kinds of creatures that can live on, the little bit of moisture that's gathered around a rock cairn, a little bit of shade that's there. And the next thing that Nicholas did was he sourced farm waste from all of his neighbors and all across Cyprus. He began to import farm waste. So any plant material that was going to be burned, he took it and he applied that plant material, that farm waste, right onto the ground and covered the soil. Then, so now he had a bunch of cairns and soil covered with vegetative matter, from his neighbors who all thought he was absolutely bananas. And then he planted his trees. And when he planted his trees, he piled green waste around the trees, making these kind of deep piles. And he also used rock lines to slow down the water that began to flow or was flowing across this site in the winters. And, this is a very Mediterranean climate. And so they get the winter deluge and then the very dry summers. And so every drop is needed. And these rock lines did that job. You can see it doing it right here. They're basically mimicking beavers by creating dams all across the landscape, strategically, but essentially all across the landscape so that water can be accumulated. Also, I want you to take a look at these trees and how the growth of the plant material is really excessive around the base of these trees where that debris had been stacked up. Yeah, it becomes very interesting when you look at it from that perspective. And then Nicholas began to accumulate all of the chickens that were finished laying. And basically, going to be eliminated in one way or another. He accumulated them and brought them onto the landscape in mass to be the animal impact on the site. So they dig up the soil, they eat the bugs, they roam around, they don't lay eggs anymore, but they shed their feathers, etc., onto the site. And that is boosting the biodiversity of the site. And he measures his success. He uses, in particular, a slake test, which is a simple in-field test that I think every single one of us should be doing in our landscapes at a year or two after they've been designed and installed. We should be going back and doing these slake tests because it is really a comprehensive soil health test. Very easy to do, as you can see here with the tools that he's using. And basically what he's done is he's setting up a jar that is, he can pour water into that mimics rain, a rain event. And then he's going to observe how long does it take for that water to percolate down through the profile of the soil and run off out the bottom of the jar. And when it does run out the bottom of the jar, what is the quality of it? And because he's dyed the water that he's pouring into these samples, so the samples that are in these columns are samples of soil from the fields. And he's dyed the water that he's putting into it so he can track where it is in the samples. And you can see by looking at the picture at the bottom that there's a sample here that is really good soil aggregation. That's really good, healthy soil. And that's the soil that has the red dye, or the water is dyed red. Look how long it's taking for that water to move through the profile of the soil, but it has moved through the profile. So in other words, it infiltrated, but it's not running off. It's staying in that soil profile. This is water holding capacity, identified right there. And look at what's going on with the blue water. The blue water ran through that soil profile. You can no longer see a distinction between, where the water is and what the soil is. So it's not like soil suspended in this water. It's soil that's just fallen apart. And all that water has gone right through, out the bottom. And you can see that you know, it's substantively unchanged from how it was when it went in. So this is the slate test that I really want to recommend everybody starts doing. I can see a run on Michael's uh, materials for building these things. But the reason that Nicholas Nedian was doing this in his olive grove and testing it like this is because he wanted to produce, and now produces, a highly phenolic olive oil. This is olive oil that has a huge complexity of phytonutrients in it. And in fact, it's actually been certified as a medicine. It is medicinal use olive oil because it is so nutrient rich. Now, remember, maybe from some of our other classes, but I'll say it again, the only way that a food becomes nutrient rich or has terroir is from the soil microbiome. All of the nutrient value of food is derived from the soil microbiome health. No healthy living soil, you can't accumulate phytonutrients in the food. In fact, that's why our food system is so degraded. So it's a really amazing proof of concept and highly successful enterprise. And it all started with rock cairns and waste. All right, let's talk about what we want to invest in installations. We've talked now about these interventions that we can make and how simple they can be to get things kind of rolling. But if we're doing an installation in a landscape, what are the things that we really should be focusing our money and investment on in order to have good outcomes? And this is a proposed hierarchy, and we can discuss it, and you can disagree with it. But soil health is number one. Say it over and over. Green waste staying on site is a way to build soil health. It doesn't cost us anything to do that. So it is essentially a waste that's actually an input into improving our soil health. Grading for simple rainwater capture, keeping it simple, making sure we don't have flat landscapes anymore. Utilizing irrigation as efficiently as possible where we need to, and all the components of that. Planting trees, making sure we're planting small plant material and we're utilizing seeds as much as possible. Making hardscape permeable so that people can have access into the landscape, but it isn't degrading the system. And then thinking maybe about how we would expand our investment into rainwater capture that was more advanced, and also into fire resilient strategies. So let's start with soil. Soil is essentially approximately 10% of your budget, but it's really 99% of the value. Almost all the case studies that I've talked about so far have been simple interventions that have maximized soil health. So yeah, this is where you spend your time and energy. And creating that living soil sponge is super important. I want us to remember that there are really three pieces of the soil sponge installation that we need to consider. The first is we want to minimize disturbance. When we disturb soil, we are actually setting that soil up for entropic effect, for being degraded. And so if we really want to have a living soil sponge as fast as possible, we do minimal or no disturbance to the site. Then the two other components are actions. They're inputs, really, that we want to stimulate. The first one is we want to stimulate decomposition. And we might do that we're certainly going to do that by keeping our organic waste on site, but also we might want to do it by importing some local compost or local mulch, essentially organic matter that can decompose. And then the second path to ensuring soil health is called the liquid carbon path. And this is the active engagement of plants, highly diverse and densely planted in our landscape, pumping carbon into the soil, pumping exudates into the soil microbiome to stimulate that soil microbiome. And so these are the three pieces of the three actions that we take. And the truth of the matter is, they're actually very inexpensive to do. They just need to be thought out and coordinated. Now, again, I showed those beautiful pictures of soil aggregation previously. This is another great picture of it. I want you to think of soil aggregation as a house for microbes. I mean, they build it themselves, and it's actually a little more than houses. It's whole cities, right? Aggregation is schools and banks and dwelling places and high rises and travel highways and public transport. It's all that stuff. It's the infrastructure of our planet, and that soil aggregation is what everything is built on. So again, we don't want to disturb it because we don't want it to destabilize. We want it to get more complex. And if we do destabilize it, especially from disturbance, we actually set up a entropic effect of grasses and weeds. Actually, it's not entropic, it's syntropic, but because it's trying to become more complex, but we've set it back. We've taken it back to a position where we're going to have weeds like forbs and grasses and annual plants come in to pump their exudates into the ground to restart this ecosystem, restart succession, basically. In terms of adding soil organic matter, compost and mulch are what we usually talk about. They are much cheaper when you buy them in bulk, and it's important to remember that you're going to need a lot of it. So it's not something you're going to just put in a can and bring to your house. If you have 1,000 square foot landscape and you're going to apply a 1/4 inch of compost to a 1 inch of compost, and we used to recommend 1 inch, but now we through research and so forth, we've realized you really don't need that much. You really only need, a 1/4 to 1/2 an inch of compost to get things going. And if that's the case, you're going to need 1 to 3 yards of this material. And then on top of everything, you want to cover the landscape, and you're going to do that with mulch. So if you had 1,000 square feet of landscape that you wanted to cover in a sufficiently deep mulch to suppress weeds and hold in moisture and support the decomposition process, you're going to need to have those 3 to 4 inches on top. And that means that for 1,000 square foot landscape, you're going to need 10 to 12 yards. And what you see right here is pretty much that. So get your head around it. You're going to need a place to manage it when it gets delivered. We want to be selecting green-brown mulches that are very small, 1.5 inches or less, so they decompose rapidly. Rapid decomposition of mulch is really important. Our objective is not to be covering the soil in something that doesn't decompose, because that doesn't help the soil biology. Over time, as the landscape becomes more complex, it will slow the decomposition process down because the living carbon process will be far bigger, far more robust, and far more efficient. So it won't need to be doing so much decomposition. Plus, the plants in your landscape will actually be contributing organic matter into the system so that it's sort of self-sustaining, and you won't need to be bringing in mulch or compost to keep it going. In terms of mulch, the very best that you can get are fresh tree trimmings. Fresh tree trimmings are covered in microbiology and it's alive. You have all the makings of a really good breakdown. Like if you were going to start a compost pile, you would start with fresh tree trimmings because it's got the green of the leaves and it's got the brown of the woody material. Now, just be aware that if you use a tree trimmer or something like a chip drop operation, they could show up at your property, wherever it is, with a 40-yard trailer. So take that picture and multiply it by 4. They could show up with that. And you're getting it for free or inexpensively. So they expect that they're just going to be able to give it to you. So you're going to need to plan ahead if you're using this option, enlist the neighbors to take some of it and definitely get it spread out as quickly as possible. One good thing to think about with fresh mulch is that it will turn into a brown, almost universally brown material, uniformly rather brown material. So it actually does become quite attractive for all those people who are, aesthetically uneducated about what fresh mulch looks like. We want to make sure that as soon as we can possibly get plants in the ground, we do. And when we put them in, again, densely planted and also diverse. Look at this picture. This picture has plants with all different kinds of leaf structures in it, all different shapes and sizes. As those leaf structures become more complex, they're an indicator of the complexity of the root systems of the plant. And so we're boosting biodiversity exponentially the more different leaf structures and plant structures we're adding into the system. When we have that diversity in plant material, we will actually be inviting the insects and birds and other members of the community to come to the site or come to our landscape. And in particular, we are inviting those pollinators that help us to, produce a landscape that's beautiful or that's productive in the case of food. And we're also inviting the natural predators for the insects that we don't want. So by having this diversity of plant material, we can eliminate the use of pesticides and save the money in the operations of the site. Never use a weed barrier. There is no reason to use a weed barrier in the landscape. It just inhibits the decomposition and you don't need to inhibit anything with soil aggregate building. So skip it and save the money and your clients can be very happy when you explain to them that you don't use it because it can be expensive. And I know it's a high value item, but in the long run, you'll come off better. Remember that building the soil moisture is going to help us with fire safety down the line. This is something for us to just, keep this in the back of our mind because we're building a landscape using the watershed approach and using all these principles. And that doesn't remove it from being fire safe. I mean, we get fire safety as a benefit by improving the soil moisture. Holding green waste on the site is super important if we possibly can. And one great way to do that, basically turn green waste into green assets, is through a process called hugelkultur. Hugelkultur is essentially burying green waste into the land, mounding soil over it, and allowing it to decompose in the soil. Now, every person who's ever taken a classic old school gardening class has been told to never bury wood. And there is rationale for that because it creates an imbalance between carbon and nitrogen in the soil, both of which are super important in your soil. And so the thought is when wood is buried, especially because it's very heavy in carbon, the nitrogen that's in the soil binds to that carbon, and it is no longer available to the plants because everybody knows plants need nitrogen in order to be healthy. Well, it turns out that all bets are off when we are building microbial community. The microbes, and in fact, some plants, make the nitrogen from the atmosphere available to the plants in the ecosystem perfectly fine. You often see hugelkultur mounds colonize. If you let them kind of colonize themselves, you don't plant anything on them, you'll find them colonized by leguminous plants. And so that's a perfect indicator that these things are coming to restore the balance of carbon and nitrogen in the soil to the microbiome, not to worry. And this is a great way to sequester carbon essentially into the landscape. When you use hugelkultur and bury logs, especially into swales or other depressions that you're using as the rain gardens, you improve the sponginess of that soil and kind of boost it. Almost the same way that the Miyawaki forest boosts productivity. It's a little bit different because this is decomposition, but it does boost the performance of the swale. And it looks beautiful after, right? It doesn't look like anything but great landscape when you're done. And really, when we intend to recycle the trees and the green waste from the site and use it in the landscape in every possible way, we're doing honor to that plant. We are acknowledging that that plant's life was valuable, and we're keeping all that carbon on our site. And carbon, as we're going to see, is the currency of landscapes. So we want as much of it as we possibly can on our site. Keep it. Also, to build things that allow us to have habitat benefits, places for bees and birds and all that sort of thing. Use it as retaining structures and building planters or a place to sit. This is all honoring the life of those plants. Even doing things that are more artful with the green waste is great. Here we have a wall, we've got some art, it's mixed in with gabion walls and stuff. And this is a great example of using everything that came from the site in some way. I'm going to talk through a quick little case study about this that I was particularly intrigued with because it shows how holding on to the green waste of a site can be a challenge, but can also yield really spectacular results that bring the humans back into the ecosystem resilience, really, and appreciation of the ecosystem. So this is a project that was done by Marilee Coleman. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's this magnificent native oak tree on this property. It had been there for a very long time. But as it turns out, it had actually been damaged when the house was built. And as often happens with trees, they don't tell you that they're having problems until they finally do. And in fact, a big storm occurred, and the result is on the bottom right-hand corner. The tree fell over, it broke, it fell over. Fortunately, it didn't fall toward the house, fell the other way. And so the landscape contractor Marilee was confronted with what to do with this. And so they got to cutting it up and turning it into material that they could use for hugelkultur. And they really went about looking at all of the contouring that they were going to do on the property to hold on to rainwater, and enhancing that with burying wood into the mounds, lining walkways with the wood, using the wood as seating areas, essentially holding on to every last bit of this carbon on the site and returning it to the site for the benefit of the microbes and the plants that are going to be there. The largest part of the trunk, which was like 45 inches in diameter or something, was actually harvested by a milling company that came to the site with a mobile mill. So they took some of the wood back to their facility so that they could kiln dry it and do some fine carpentry with it, and which I'll show you in a second. But they created right on site with the mobile mill these amazing slabs with live edges on them of wood that could be used in the project in a variety of ways. And here's the finished project, part of the project that utilized the wood. So you can see surrounding the doors and windows is this kiln dried, locally milled wood oak tree that used to stand in the front yard of this site. And that is a beautiful connectivity where the property owners every single day get to continue to see that oak tree that they, had since they purchased the home, and they get to appreciate the new aspect of the aesthetics and beauty of that oak tree in their living environment. It brings them great joy. So it's the kiln dried wood around all the doors and windows. And then you can see one of those live edge slabs actually used as a shelf in the wall. And here's a little close up of that live edge slab. It actually intrudes into the building, which is super cool. And now talking about syntropy, because now we're talking about the human aspect of syntropy. We've gone through kind of the plant and so forth, the microbiome and all that good stuff. And now we're on how the humans are interacting with the site and how it continues to become more complex. Look at these little joints that were created by the carpenter, the craftsperson who put together these live edge pieces. These little joints were crafted from a piece of walnut that this craft person had since their childhood. And on every single project that they work on, they take a small quantity of this walnut wood and they put it into the project so that a piece of their entire life's history is actually embedded in this project. When we talk about ecosystem projects, ecosystem design, we're going to this level too. We're not just talking about the wham bam, plant it ma'am. We're talking about the engagement of every single person who interacts with this site. So don't forget that in terms of installation, we do want to make sure there are no flat yards. We have to grade for rainwater capture. That should be 20% of our budget. Again, 150 square feet is all we need for 1,000 square feet of roof. And just keep it at 6 inches deep. Look at this rain garden. I mean, this is a very, very, very simple rain garden, but look how much water is being held. Actually, all the water coming off this portion of the roof is held in this very simple rain garden. You don't need cobbles and gravel and all this fancy stuff. I mean, I suppose you can do it if that's the aesthetic, but it's great to educate people that in most ecosystems, that stuff isn't present. Really, what's present is just the divot in the landscape, the fallen debris from the trees, the plants that are establishing there. Skip all that additional cost and so forth to stick with something really simple. Save your money. And if you are going to buy site amenities that are rock, buy larger boulders that people can interact with and sit on, or that can be purchased for birds, or can be, an aesthetic addition to the landscape, and also to pay for the labor to install it into your landscape. When you do your contouring, immediately be thinking about how you can plant trees adjacent to your contouring. Trees need the water needs the trees. So your swales and rain gardens become significantly improved when they're planted near trees, because trees themselves act like cisterns. Make sure that when you get into dealing with the irrigation of your landscape, you're really looking at ways to fix leaks and also prevent leaks from happening. Leaks are a very expensive part of a landscape. Consider installing a dedicated irrigation main line and meter. The main line is going to help you to separate the home water from the irrigation water. And then having a sub-meter or a flow meter on that main line allows you to actually monitor how much water is going into the landscape. And there are other reasons, why you may want to have a sub-meter of some kind. If you have a sewer surcharge, you might want to get an actual sub-meter. Or if you have a swimming pool or some other element that uses a lot of water, and you really want to meter it, or you really want to monitor it, you need to meter it in order to know what's going on. And there are devices that can be attached to existing meters, like flumes and so forth. These are all really good examples of ways to become more involved in the landscape management. If you are going to be installing a main line in the landscape, make sure it's at the proper depth and it's the right copper. I'm just saying, I can't tell you how many landscapes we've encountered where savings are made by installing the wrong kind of copper pipe, which obviously is an entropic intervention because it degrades very quickly. If you're doing any kind of hardscape, or you're interacting with existing hardscape, even if it's permeable hardscape, do sleeving. Contractors often push up against having to do 2 to 4 inch sleeves for the labor and the material and so forth. But honestly, sleeving for pipes, for irrigation, lighting, etc., is really a great way to save money down the line. And it protects those pipes from damage, and it protects you from frustration. Also sleeve with blank tubing under hardscape for your drip irrigation. Valves. Many times when we're installing landscapes, we're under pressure to keep the price down, and we don't actually devote enough of our budget to putting in or to hydrozoning properly and putting in more valves rather than fewer. When we have irrigation valves, we have control. And so if we really want to improve our irrigation control, the valve is a place that we, it's like the direct hands-on control of how much water's going into this landscape. And it allows us to really manage to a water budget when we have the landscape dialed into a lot of valve zones and hydrozones. Make sure you're separating trees and shrubs from ground covers. That's a kind of a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised. And make sure that when your valves are installed, if they're anti-siphon valves, that they are Schedule 80 above ground, please. Also, shut-off valves are another way to have control. I mean, irrigation valves are one way, but shut-offs on your piping are another way to control, because when you have an emergency and you have to track down a leak, or you have to deal in some way with repairing and replacing a portion of your system, having these shut-off valves, it gives you the freedom to be able to address a problem and not have to worry about whether your landscape continues to be irrigated or whatever. So really having shut-off valves at all the critical junctions, and even at each valve on the manifold, is a good idea. And put shut-off valves on the end of hose bibs and on each hose. And while you're at it, do the pressure regulation too, and get that pressure down to the right one for your low flow irrigation. Manual flush valves should be installed in your landscape rather than the automatic flush valves. They are water wasters, and they, again, you lose control with them. They often leak. They're they're not really more convenient. So yeah, do manual flush valves. Very simple to do and actually less expensive. Um, Make sure you put them in valve boxes that are not directly at against the hardscape, that they're pointing into the landscape so that you can, open them into the landscape and save the water. And co-locate your flush valves with your tattletales on the drip lines so that you know, hey, this is the end of the line and it's working and so forth. It's easy to find the flush valve then when the landscape grows up. Make sure that you are cleaning out your filters at least twice a year. This is a maintenance issue, but if you're going to do drip irrigation, by gum, keep it working right. Uh, and thanks to John Tukotsky for doing the hand modeling in this picture. If you do have drip irrigation tubing, make sure it stays covered with 4 inches of mulch, either mulch that you've brought in the early stages of the landscape, or it is covered with the mulch from the debris from the plants in the landscape. Now, in terms of planting, in terms of turf transformation, start small. Consider doing just a portion of the landscape that allows everybody in the community and the home, even the contractor, to get accustomed to all this. It doesn't all have to be done at once. We call this giving 25% to nature, basically taking a quarter of the landscape and removing that grass there and replacing that with plant material that's climate appropriate and so forth, and efficient irrigation, and then leave the grass area for now to be converted later, or maybe even just to be left that way. This is a really great way to leg into a project. And when you do the edge like this, you're actually giving yourself a chance to improve your irrigation efficiency and reduce runoff, because often the spray heads that are against the hardscape are right there and they're spraying onto the hardscape. And so when you remove the grass there and replace it with drip, you're actually eliminating that overspray. So now the borders are planted, you have this little grass area in the inside, and you've accomplished a bunch of results and have a really thriving garden. Whoops. If it's still too much to consider, by taking out the grass, consider overseeding your grass with things like clover and so forth to build biodiversity. It can be as simple as just putting clover down, something that's nitrogen boosting. And this can be done extremely inexpensively. Like the projects that we're doing are between 75 cents and $1.75. So it's one way to kick off the syntropic effects of your landscape. And you can always transition to other plant material later. You're basically harnessing succession with that idea. If you're going to be using trees, consider using bare root trees. There's a lot of literature around bare root trees that talks about it being a faster establishment, a healthier approach, because the plants are not adapted, they're not growing in a sort of fake microbiome or fertilized microbiome of a container that is then being transferred into a landscape. So, the jury's kind of out on this, but there's some good literature on bare root planting. Consider doing it. Seeds are an excellent way to boost your biodiversity in the landscape. Even if you're putting in woody shrubs, perennials, and so forth, overseed. Put more diversity in there. Let's get that soil microbiome going at a super low cost. Remember, each of these seeds is bringing billions and billions, up to 9 billion microbes per seed. When we're doing ground cover, consider utilizing flats instead of going for sods and so forth. If you can't grow it from seed, grow it from flat. This is the most cost-effective way to do it. And you can actually make very small plants out of it. And anytime you're planting a landscape, go with the smallest healthy plant that you can. If you have a choice between a 1 gallon and a quart size container, and both of those plants are healthy, go with the quart size container, because that plant introduced into its new soil conditions will acclimatize and adapt to that site a lot faster than the plant that has had to adapt to growing into a container. And now it's got to shift gears and go into the soil, the native soil or the in situ soil. So always plant with the smallest plant that you can. If you need to be doing permeable pathways, make sure that they are permeable, but they're also ADA compliant. We want to hold as much stormwater on the site, that's a given, and our walkways can actually help us to do that. Consider using stormwater grid and gravel, which is a much lower cost option than doing other types of permeable paving. If you're going to be using decomposed granite, it's a great option for paths or gathering spaces, but it's a terrible option for mulch. And we'll talk about that in a second. If you've got existing materials or existing hardscape, you can actually intervene into those hardscapes with pretty simple interventions that allow you to make them more permeable. Always grade your hardscape toward the landscape. And here's a great example of a hardscape that was enhanced by making gaps in it, and also taking the pavers in the middle and making them permeable. If you have a very large impermeable area, then consider investing in a more active stormwater capture feature. So this isn't just the, 150 square feet, 6 inches deep capture. This is doing some kind of infiltration pit, doing some kind of cistern, or a combination of both of them. A more active approach, something that requires more investment and time, materials, and know-how. But if it's a very large impermeable area, this is one way that you can intervene to actually integrate that impermeable area into your nature-based solution. Consider doing metal cisterns, especially in fire zones, that are available to capture rainwater with solar pumps that allow you to pump out that water supply if there is a fire on the horizon. But also using these for irrigation offset is completely legitimate in places where it's necessary. Take advantage of all the municipal incentives that you can, especially with regard to stormwater. If there is a curb cutting incentive, go for it. And also be sure to include FireWise design in your landscape design and installation. Now, it doesn't cost any more really to do FireWise design over doing a watershed-wise plan. It's all the same thing. But there are elements, and I'm going to mention 2 in particular, that are worth a big investment from the clients, and it will also be a big investment in terms of labor and materials for the installer. And these are both about home hardening. The first one is much bigger investment, and that has to do with the roof composition. Roof composition and health of the roof, super important, especially in fire zones. Definitely be able to talk to clients about that. And then a really low cost, but very, very high value investment in house hardening is covering your vents with small metal screens. 1/8 of an inch or smaller openings, definitely not plastic. You want to cover the vents both at the attic or crawl space or also in the crawl space. Everything needs to be covered because this is what keeps embers from entering your house and burning it down. All right, so we've talked a lot about a bunch of investments that we can make that are easy and super effective. Let's talk about value-added design. The value of planning absolutely cannot be overrated. The person funding the project should be thinking between 10 and 20% of the total budget of the project for planning, depending on the complexity of the site. The biggest threat to any value added, whether it's design or installation in a landscape, is compaction. And the worst compaction is brain compaction. And brain compaction is basically a lack of vision, an inability to recognize the limitations that we're placing on ourselves and work to overcome those limitations. We put preconceived notions, preconceived ideas, and we take ourselves out of being biological, with the emphasis on logic. We often do this as a fear response to new ideas or new implementation. This is absolutely understandable for designers who are taking on massive risk, for installers who take on massive risk. But really, this is the most important thing we need to overcome. We need to be open to new ideas and be thinking about syntropy. The big paradigm shift that we need to start implementing in our lives is getting away from the idea of looking at a landscape as what is it that I need to do here to control or kill, and shift that to what do I need to encourage or stimulate on the site to get the syntropic effect. These are two completely different ways of looking at a landscape, at looking at interventions on a landscape. When we go the control living things or kill living things approach, this is a fast track to entropy. When we go the encourage or stimulate path, we're working with syntropy. And we want to incorporate into our design process regenerative aspects. We want to be thinking about regeneration. And essentially, this is allowing these human designed systems to come into alignment with natural processes. So as we're designing, instead of reaching immediately for the what I'm going to call gray infrastructure solution, we first go to how does nature do this? How can we get as close as possible to mimicking that natural process, and expanding and enhancing that natural process? And when we as humans are in alignment with that thinking, we become more valuable in the design process because we are actually moving all the solutions toward nature-based solutions. And we need to upfront in our design acknowledge that there really is this interdependence between our human activity and the ecosystem itself. We are not taking humans out of the equation. In other words, it's not about low maintenance landscapes. It's not about no irrigation landscapes. It's not about applying pesticides to get rid of something. Okay, it's about finding a way to integrate the humans into the ecosystem and do what's best for both. When we take a regenerative approach, we find that sustainable is no longer a good enough goal. Sustainable keeps us where we are. It is literally to sustain. And when we are sustaining in a dynamic system, we are confronting a lot of uncertainty. So what we want to be doing is thinking, how do we make our goals more about resilience, restoring functionality of a landscape so that it can become more resilient, and then actually regenerating original functionality, regenerating processes that are self-sustaining so that we have true safety from the ecosystem, from the landscape. It's a little heady, but I think this is really something we need to be thinking about. We have 8 regenerative approaches, tactics that we employ at G3, and they're here and we will have them available to you. Since everything comes back to soil health, I'm going to home in on those 3 things. Minimal disturbance, avoiding that disturbance of ecological processes in succession, keeping living roots in soil all the time, not just in the wet season, but dry season and the wet season so that they can create that soil structure through the liquid carbon pathway, and having a great deal of diversity in the selection of our plant material so that we are actually energizing that microbiome. And in fact, we should really have number 4 highlighted here to cover the mother. Covering the mother means essentially utilizing plant debris and mulch and living ground cover to have armor on the top of the soil so that it does not degrade, it isn't getting sun degradation or water degradation. It protects it from compaction, and it feeds that microbial community, the decomposition pathway. Let's look at a quick little case study that highlights the importance of prioritizing your good areas. So many of us, when we go into landscapes, retrofits, we immediately think about what's the worst thing here that we want to change and how do we change it. But you have to realize that it's going to take the longest amount of time, most amount of energy, and the most amount of money in order to repair that worst area. What if we started with the best thing and we enhanced that first? Could we actually boost our syntropic effect by doing that? And in this particular case, this is the Hamala Canyon Ranch at the White Buffalo Land Trust up in the Central Coast. And they had a riparian area that was somewhat degraded, but it had a lot of native plants on it. And you can see here that these are native plants identified on the site that are riparian plants that are already existing. And so when White Buffalo Land Trust had to make decisions about where they were going to invest money in restoration of various parts of this site, the riparian area came to the top very quickly. And the reason for that is, one, it already has some good stuff going on that just needs to be enhanced, but also the benefits that are derived from working with the riparian area are the same benefits that we would derive from doing the rain garden on the site, right? It's the same idea, holding on to as much water in the site, directing that water into the landscape. And so White Buffalo Land Trust went through a process where they began to prioritize the multi-benefit and nature-based solutions that they would want to have realized in their riparian area. They want to enhance soil moisture and infiltration, water holding capacity. They'd love to see stream flow restored. Like right now, this riparian area is a seasonal stream, but wouldn't it be great if it had stream flow all year round? Good sustained stream flow. How do we make sure that that stream is not being degraded, but it's actually the channel is improving? And how do we make sure that the plants that are going to be introduced into this and the ones that are there remain alive, that we get good canopy cover for the cooling effects, and our water quality improves? So basically, they're looking at all of these multi-benefits and they're starting to rank them and bucket them into these ecological impacts that they're trying to achieve. And then what is it that they're going to actually have to do in order to reach that? Setting goals is also a really important part of your design process, because you want to make sure that you have something that you can measure success against your projections. So doing those projections is as much of a part of it as just doing the design. So let's get into some landscape design. And this is actually, I think this might even be a plan that we saw with Metropolitan, now that I think about it, a very simple landscape plan. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, does this meet our objectives for syntropic design? They could, but maybe not. We'll see. The challenge that we face in a lot of the turf removal programs, not so much in the aspects that are being funded by the agencies, but what I'm going to call the knock-on effect, the people who are doing changes maybe without the monetary support of the water agencies and without any education about what they're supposed to be doing, what we are ending up with in a lot of cases are what you see here. Here we have a decomposed granite landscape. It yeah, doesn't even have, plants in it really. Is this what we want from a turf removal program that's funded and also that inspires others, or the inspired folks? I don't think so. And there are even some plans. These are all from water agency websites as projects that not only got approved, but are also highlighted on the websites. And I'm just asking, hey, are we actually achieving our objectives with these kinds of landscapes? Or are we creating heat islands? What are the multi-benefits that we're really achieving here? Do things like this actually meet our objective? What about this one? A lot of gravel there. How about this? Is this meeting our objective? Is this holding on to stormwater? I don't even think there are gutters on that side of the house. How about this? Is this meeting our objectives? The gutter is way over across here, and then all of this is covered with rock. Is that actually meeting the objective of ecosystem design? We have to really look very carefully at this and be open to thinking about what we need to do in order to not end up with this. And I'm not saying that this would be approved by a water agency. It absolutely would not. But these are property owners who are taking actions based on the idea that they think they're saving water. And what we end up with are landscapes that are absolutely entropic and degrading. Synthetic grass on one side, plastic weed barrier covered by rock on the other. This $9 million home featured synthetic turf, and in the brochure said it's a water saving and environmentally friendlier than real grass. Is that true? So here's some better things to think about for design. If you had a property like this, consider planting densely and ending up with something more like this. Oops. Having multiple rain garden depressions, very, very simple, just mulch covered that capture all of the roof runoff from the site. Or what about this one? Here we have shallow depressions, lots of living mulch, large shrubs. It's a new landscape, so you don't see it all, but it's pretty densely planted as well. Maybe this is better. Here we've included a little rain garden that's just a 6-inch depression. We have drip irrigation, living mulch, and an 80% plant coverage at maturity. And of course, we have daffodils to remind them that Southern California has a spring. Or what about this one? Here we have a rain garden that captures all the roof runoff. It recycles all the green waste from the site and is densely planted. Here we have dense planting, living mulch, vegetated rain gardens, and permeable surfaces. Let's train our eyes to what actually is the kind of landscape we're looking for. Dense planting, living mulch, vegetated rain gardens, permeable surfaces. Oops, yeah, same thing. These are all syntropic landscapes. And here we even have one densely planted living mulch, shallow vegetation rain garden with no irrigation in year 2 and so forth. Same thing here. And here. Okay, how do we value these landscapes? Well, we've been talking about value for this whole time, but now let's kind of get down to some methodologies for valuing and some sources for coming up with ecosystem service value, which is different from the value of a particular plant or a particular element of the whole system. don't forget that in our systems, we have water, carbon, heat, all kinds of things that are in motion. They're cycling in these landscapes. A watershed-wise landscape is cycling. And that makes it really difficult to pinpoint, one value. So in these systems that are working this way as environmental design or nature-based solutions that have all these cycles going on, we need to try to value them as complex elements as opposed to breaking them apart. Now, in general, carbon is the currency of nature. If the landscape is not minimizing the disturbance of carbon and sequestering it through the plant material and waste and reduction of emissions and so forth, but especially sequestering, which is what plants are doing, then it can't be a valuable landscape because it isn't building carbon in it. And ultimately, it's the carbon that has value, whether we're talking value in terms of dollars or value in terms of performance. We can actually evaluate and put dollar amounts on water supply and water quality benefits. This particular discussion is actually inspired by a webinar that I took with Brad Lancaster, and is referencing information in his Water Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond book. But essentially what Brad did was he took a look at he took a look at two landscapes. One in which there's no rainwater capture, it's covered in impermeable surface, it's not densely planted, basically entropic design, compared to his landscape, which is the epitome of syntropic. All the things going on here, very complex, etc. The first thing that he notices about these two sites is that they have vastly different cooling or heating effects. The one on the left is actually adding 10 degrees to the ambient temperature radiating off of that landscape. Whereas with all the tree canopy cover and all the vegetation and cool soil, we're actually reducing the ambient temperature by 10 degrees in the regenerative landscape and syntropic landscape. But then Brad actually goes into a little analysis where he says, okay, what if precipitation it's like a big bank account, like with a big water bank account, and precipitation fills up my bank account, but evaporation and evapotranspiration reduce the bank account. Is this something that we can use to evaluate our landscape? And by Jove, it is. This is a lot of the underlying fundamentals of the M. Wheelow valuation of a landscape. The functionality of plant material and from an evapotranspiration point of view, and the efficiency of the irrigation system delivering water to the soil. But anyway, here, Brad is saying, okay, in Tucson, he receives about 12 inches of water a year from precipitation. On the left, they hold on to none of that on that landscape. On the right, they hold on to all of that in the landscape. So that's a gain of 12 inches of water into the bank account for the regenerative landscape that the other one couldn't claim. Then he looked at how much water is released from the soil. And in the case of the entropic landscape, it isn't evapotranspiring at all. The plants aren't managing. I mean, there are no plants here to really manage the water from the soil. So what you're experiencing here is called pan evaporation. This is max evaporation. It's not even a reference evapotranspiration, which is intermediated. This is full out. If I had a metal sheet pan filled with water, how fast would that water come off the sheet pan? That's what's going on in the one on the left, because it's hotter, etc. So I'm actually losing out of my water bank account 104 inches of water a year. This is a big difference, right? That means that landscape is using 104 inches of water, no question. But on the other side, I have all these plants that are intermediating the water that's in the soil. So they are evapotranspiring and putting that water into the atmosphere purposefully. And it turns out that my evapotranspiration rate is quite a bit less than my pan evaporation rate. And this is a benefit that I'm receiving not just by having that plant material, but also by the effect, the compounding effect that the plant material is cooling things off over here in this other landscape. So in the landscape that has the plants on it, we're only releasing 78 inches of water a year from that site, which means that the syntropic landscape is really reducing the amount of water lost out of the soil by 38 inches a year. This is a way that we can start to get to, if we can value that water as supply and also as runoff and as water quality, we could actually start to get at a price tag for that cooler landscape. Now, as more people move into the urban areas, the health of the urbanites becomes more important and more valuable. So human health, human happiness, and access to open space, open play space becomes much more valuable. And so landscapes that provide that are much more valuable than landscapes that don't. We can take individual elements of the landscape and try to value them. And this is done. There are all kinds of calculators for like, what's the value of a tree? And this is the methodology that's used for that. But in reality, this is not the value of a tree in a syntropic design, right? Because we have to value trees by the ecosystem services they provide. And trees in companionship are going to provide much more support to insects and birds and other creatures, not the least of which are humans, than individual trees are going to do. So there's a multiplier value on trees as they become more mature and as they grow in systems. When we are actually putting a value on the project, we want to think through all those possible ecosystem services, which is very much what like Hamal Ranch or White Buffalo was doing. And don't forget to add into your ecosystem services the mental and physical well-being, and then just plain out joy for being outside. So a model that is pretty good if you're up for the dry read is from the Pacific Institute, which is doing nature-based solution accounting. It's kind of interesting. There is a working group that is working toward developing agreed upon values for these various ecosystem services and then stacking them up in landscapes and adding them up at the end. If you're not testing and monitoring, and if that doesn't become part of your ongoing management of the site, there really isn't any way to value the landscape after it's planted and you walk away. So in order for us to make landscapes more valuable, we actually have to include into our management of the sites a monitoring and testing component so that we can see, hey, what is going on and how do we identify these things? Because that data is going to help us to build much more regenerative and resilient landscapes. Hey, a soil probe is probably the least expensive thing that you can buy to find out what's really going on in your landscape. So go out and get yourself a soil probe. We really should be thinking about the actual supply chain costs of landscapes like this one, for example, that is covered with so much decomposed granite or gravel. And that really needs to be put into our evaluation. And also, what is the value of carbon emissions and green waste production if we're doing conventional turf removal, spraying it with a with a herbicide and then removing it. In a literature review that we've conducted, we find that anywhere between 1/2 pound and 2 pounds of carbon are removed from the site per square foot when we take the grass out. We need to account for that in our evaluation of the new landscape. Because remember, it's going to take some time to build that back up with a new landscape. And if we have landscapes, for example, that are covered with decomposed granite, where's that stuff from? I mean, we actually mine decomposed granite here in California, but take a look at that. I mean, this is not just greenhouse gas emissions. I was being kind there, but it really is habitat destruction. For what? For decomposed granite to go down in landscapes? And then we have the hauling and transport and carbon costs that really should be included if we want a fair valuation. There's a wonderful local nonprofit called Arla, and we will send you the link, and maybe Marianne can put it into the chat, of this site evaluation and valuation tool set. It's really great. You can actually find a site, home in on it, and then begin to get information about what the existing conditions are and things that you would actually do to improve the site. And let's not forget that insurers are more and more setting the actual value and determining the actual value of landscapes. And that means that we have to get better at doing our own evaluations so that there can be really open discussion, because talk about a compacted industry. Okay, finally, multiplier effect, what the community benefits are. Here's the saying that I want you to take away. One tree does not make a forest. And this is on so many levels. It's not just meaning that if you only have one tree, you can't count it as a forest. I mean, it's good, but it needs more. But it's really also a way of getting at the notion that one individual, one action, one intervention, one benefit, one component of these designs is not enough. We need to be working in broader community. We need to be thinking about the system as a whole and really, really designing for complexity. Pacific Institute, again, has some great materials on helping people evaluate what are the multiple benefits, the ecosystem benefits that can be gained from having this syntropic design and ecosystem thinking. I think this is a wonderful graphic that could be shared, with any commercial property holder, or HOA, or whatever, to really get the conversation started. And in terms of community, we need to say it out loud. Which vision of the future do we prefer? Do we prefer green, growing, flowering, prospering, abundant, or do we prefer what we see on the bottom? We can choose to go in either direction, but one of them is going to be more regenerative and self-sustaining. An example, kind of a case study of a way a community is brought into these designs is through pollinator corridors. Pollinator corridors are magnificent because they can happen on public property, they can happen on very small parcels, they can happen on private property adjacent to public property. And the benefits that are enjoyed by these pollinator corridors are also enjoyed by the people who are interacting with them. So this is a really great way to start to think about how we take our good nature-based solutions out to the public. And let's consider all the tools in the toolbox. In other states, there are incentives for doing grassland reconstructions, basically, instead native grassland reconstructions, instead of having cool season or warm season, typical warm season lawn. So incentives are paid to remove the lawn, and replace it with prairie, which needs to be nurtured and so forth. But it's really more closely mimicking the natural prairie system in this place. And we in California have very long history of savannas and grasslands. So, why not? If it ticks the boxes, let's open our minds to doing more of these tools. Polyculture lawn, which we're very highly involved in, is another nature-based solution that we want to be adding to the toolbox, because polyculture lawn puts the fun back in non-functional turf. It actually turns it into a nature-based solution. And we think that people deserve a very easy way to enjoy nature in their own community. And some of them really like to be on lawn. And so this is a way to do it, but it doesn't compromise any of the goals that we are looking to obtain in the programs that are being supported in our community. Uh, Landscapes can actually heal us from a chronic deficit of nature. And so let's make sure that we have ways for people to interact. When humans are in a landscape and they interact with the plants and everything, the brains are hardwired to actually be rejuvenated. So even just, peering up into a tree like this stimulates they were observing fractals and all these complex structures, and it stimulates our brain. It actually boosts creativity. It boosts problem solving. If we really want to have a productive society, we need a heck of a lot more landscapes and more complicated ones. Don't forget that every time we intervene in a situation, every action that's taken or an action that's not taken is going to lead to a compounding or cascading effect in the landscape. And so we need to be thoughtful in the ways that we intervene. And I want to tie this to a bigger community issue. When we have landscape degradation and environmental catastrophe, we create climate refugees. And global migration is actually pushing people into urban centers. It's at an all-time high now in 2025. 55% of the global population lives in urban centers. That's 8.2 billion people are living in cities. And by 2050, the UN estimates that 68%, or with the growth, 10 billion people are going to be living in cities. This is why we need to have landscapes in urban environments, because this is going to be a cascading or compounding effect on our on everything we hold dear. And it was already seen in Syria uh, 6 years ago. Unrest was fomented by mass migration to the cities from the rural areas as a result of drought. And on top of it, we have a situation, we have rising prices, we have increased debt for um, all of our talk of decreasing interest rates. Debt is increasing, and as a result, stressors are being felt by individuals and communities. In fact, the communities are breaking down, and we are seeing it not just in rural areas. I mean, the farmer suicide rate, was unprecedented in 2021. It has increased. It's not decreased since then. And this is just an indicator, right? This is not in isolation. So when we see communities breaking down, we need to understand that it fuels civil unrest. And if we don't want civil unrest, we need to build landscapes. So if we can get out there and start focusing on soil health and building communities and getting landscapes in the ground with real nature-based solutions, we can actually have massive global change. Join us on October 8th and 9th for our professional training. We get into this a little bit. We talk a lot about soil. We'd love to see you.
That is just an amazing presentation. That was so, so inspiring.
I'm
So
glad you liked it.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I hope
yeah.
other people did.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are absolutely captivated by very, very new ideas and different ways of looking at the landscape. We did get some questions, some of which I could answer, others which I think would be great to hear your feedback on. Before I start, I did put in the chat a link to the survey. We really, really appreciate your feedback as to what we can do better, what worked for you. One of the things that would really be interesting for us as we look at next year is what other topics would you be interested in having us present or create for you? And nothing is too far-fetched. So yeah, put that in the
But
survey as well.
yeah, I've said it before that one of the beauties, really amazing benefits of this relationship and of this opportunity for professional training is that the deepest professional training is happening in my own compacted brain. I absolutely love the opportunity to read all this research and be able to ultimately have discussions with people after the fact. Many of you interact with us, beyond this particular event, and it's always stimulating. I learn a huge amount, and I learn from you, and I learn from this opportunity. So I thank you for participating and making it possible. And yeah, definitely let us know what other kinds of things you'd like to hear about, what other maybe new research you've been wanting to dig into. We're we're interested in figuring out and tying it all back, of course, to uh it obviously has to be landscaping oriented, but tying it all back to practical nature-based solutions and practical or technical training that we need to have in order to achieve our objectives.
Yeah. All right. So the class, the questions are coming. This is what happens. The questions all come at the end, but we've got a few minutes. Unbelievable. We have a few minutes to answer
I know,
questions.
I really tried.
So the first one is, it just came in. When you speak about adding seeds to a new landscape, are you referring to the polyculture lawn type seeds, flowering annuals, grasses, what?
All the above. Yeah, all the above. I mean, every single landscape, especially if especially if grass has been removed, right? That landscape needs to build back its carbon. And yes, you're trying to do it with decomposition, but your microbial community is not super robust. It becomes robust from the plants pumping exudates. So what's the cheapest way to get a lot of plant cover in there? And that's basically seeds. So are there areas where you can do, a blend of native grass seeds to get things going? Are there areas that you want to plant annuals in it to, that you're not specially irrigating them or anything, see what comes up. If you want to ultimately build a perennial landscape, then yes, we're definitely talking about polyculture lawn because polyculture lawn is geared to perennial landscape uh, and doing that exclusively really with seed. But in, you know, so I mean, 15 years ago, there are people on this class who participated in the building of demonstration projects 15 years ago. And one thing that we did at the time, which seemed a little bit wackadoodle, was we planted a bunch of bulbs. And I mean, all kinds of stuff that isn't even classically California bulbs, like there's daffodils and, all kinds of stuff, as well as South African bulbs and some native California bulbs and stuff like that. But we went in and planted groups of those things. And it's very, very interesting. A lot of those landscapes have degraded, really beyond recognition, and those bulb clusters continue to do their thing. And they continue to be surprising in the spring or the fall. They continue to be beautiful. They continue to be interesting. And it just, you know, reinforces for me that landscapes have to be multi-layered. and not to be worried about green waste. So be willing to let things do their job and then not thrive. I mean, that's okay. So especially when you're using seed, you're actually saying, hey, come in here, do this job, pump some carbon or pump some nitrogen or mine some calcium or whatever. And then, when I don't need you anymore, when we're, getting more and more mature and I have like more plant cover or whatever, I can coppice you to the ground or I can get rid of you. And then, other plants are going to take over that job that you were doing to get us going. The other thing is I saw a question about green waste with dense planting. No, we keep all the green waste on site. So it's chop and drop. Chop and drop, even
Yeah.
in fire zones.
Yeah. And again, when you think about a natural system, right?
Yeah.
There's abundance and there's a natural sort of resolving of what needs to be growing and to what extent and what gets stunted or disappears completely. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely, I mean, we have a lot of little compaction. It's not, and you know what? I say compaction like in a negative way, but sometimes compaction is a good thing. It's protective. Um, So, but we do have it to get over the idea of the control kill versus enhance, engage.
Great, great. So here's a question that just came in. Left with questions about supplemental irrigation and types of irrigation that require spray. So I guess the question is, how does that fit into these Southern California landscapes?
It's the most efficient irrigation that you can utilize for your site. Your site determines what's efficient. I mean, it's just plain old not efficient to run miles and miles and miles and miles of drip line if you've got a big old hillside that's you got an acre and a half of hillside or an acre and a half of landscape, and it's it just it doesn't make sense to run lots and lots of drip line. You probably want to do spray, and you'd probably maybe want to have trees and shrubs on drip. All of that is dependent on the very first principle, regenerative principle, is right plan in the right place. It's not right plant. I mean, that's part of it, but it's right plan in the right place, which means you spend a lot more time observing and thinking through and doing analysis in order to home in on what your interventions are going to be. And so in terms of designing your irrigation, it's not just, oh yeah, I'm going to grab drip because it's the right thing. I mean, look, drip is ultimately the most efficient thing, like just mechanically speaking, right? It delivers water to the roots of plants. Plants take water through their roots, people. That's how they get the water out of the soil. I'm sorry, the leaves don't extract the water. The roots extract the water. I mean, the leaves are part of it, but but it's roots. So the whole idea that spray is more efficient, no,
All
not
right.
for plant. Plant just wants the water. Most efficient water is no irrigation.
All right, so we can do one more question, and I did before we do that, just want to make sure Jennifer or Allison was, because we are coming up against the hour there. And thank you for your patience for those that are still with us. Is there anything that you would like to say? And then we'll take one more question and call it a day. Allison, Jennifer, anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
No, just happy to have everybody here. Thank you so much. And let me get back to you guys so you can get one more question in.
Same thing. Thank you so much for being here, and look forward to that last question.
All right, last question. How can we factor or think about plants that were brought in ages ago and are now invasive to a native environment? And I had a bunch of questions about nutgrass. So, so how does that fit into this syntropy model?
Well, everything is evolving. One. So working with evolution instead of trying to, and yeah, I mean, it's a very, very big picture response in a way. But part of it is figuring out how to make an aesthetic that works with plants. And when I say aesthetic, I mean not just like visual aesthetic, but aesthetic as in we live with this. And managing it through education and through experimentation and through adding plant material into the site. I mean, that's how we're dealing with Nut's Edge right now, is knocking it back with mowing and adding, managing the water, the irrigation, and adding plant material that mimics the Nut's Edge. So we are getting a visually aesthetic result that you can't pick the Nut's Edge out of the pack. Does it take patience? Does it take communication? Does it take, sleepless nights? Yes, it does. But much preferred to applying some kind of chemical that affects the soil microbiome and also doesn't stay on the site.
Yeah. Yeah.
In our opinion, right? And that's the human aspect of it. So I don't know if I answered or not, but
Yeah. And I think also not everything has an answer.
Yeah.
There is an evolution, there is an experimenting, there is, well, this doesn't work. And the idea that sometimes, and we've sort of said it with the nutgrass, it's like when in Rome, because you can't eradicate it. So it's like,
I mean,
how do you work with it?
we could eat it. We could figure out a way to eat the darn stuff.
Mhm.
Right? If the thing became a crop,
Right.
like, you know what? I think I mentioned this before, but spinach used to be an invasive plant. And we learned how to eat it. And now it's not an invasive plant anymore. It's cultivated.
It's a crop.
So, I mean, I'm just saying, there are other things. And that's the same thing for like, I know I've said this many times before, but the notion that the brassicas on hillsides are, oh, what an evil thing, we have to go and pull them out. The minute you pull them out, you're creating the disturbance that favors brassicas. Right? They need to be knocked back, preferably by an animal that has a rumen. So, get mule out there, Thule, like, what is it? Or buffalo or some other thing, So, and then you wouldn't see it anymore, right? If the symbiotic relationship between animal intervention, maybe fire too, but certainly animal disturbance and the land was reestablished, you wouldn't have that invasion. It's because the land craves the animal and has become degraded that seed expresses itself in that place.